07:42 a.m., September 7th, 1944, near the rural outskirts of Yorkshire, England. Camp 174 held 230 German prisoners, most captured during the Normandy breakout. Survival rates in transit camps averaged 94%, but dignity remained unmeasured. Karl Becker, formerly of the 352nd Infantry Division, stood at the wire perimeter watching morning fog settle across harvested fields. The stench of unwashed uniforms mixed with coal smoke from the guardhouse stove. Behind him, radio static crackled as the camp commandant received instructions from regional command. That afternoon, an unusual directive arrived. Selected prisoners would accept a civilian dinner invitation. The order cited Agricultural Ministry Directive 23B, encouraging local cooperation with POW labour programmes. Karl's hands tightened on the wire. The invitation wasn't protocol. In the commandant's logbook, a single notation appeared. Gesture approved. Observe reactions. The war had taught him that mercy often preceded something harder to name. By mid-afternoon on September 7, 1944, the selection process began in the compound's administrative hut. Commandant William Ashford reviewed prisoner files with methodical precision, noting work performance and disciplinary records. Karl Becker's file showed consistent field labour, no infractions, basic English comprehension. 5 others received similar clearance. The invitation had arrived 2 days prior from Henry Thompson, whose farm supplied vegetables to 3 regional camps under the War Agricultural Executive Committee's production quotas. Thompson's letter, typed on thin wartime paper, requested permission to host several prisoners for evening dinner. In recognition of their labour contributions, and in the spirit of Christian charity, the letter stated. Ashford had initially dismissed it as naive sentiment, but regional command approved the request within 18 hours. The speed of authorization suggested someone higher wanted the experiment observed. Karl stood before Ashford's desk as the commandant explained the arrangement in deliberate English. You will represent this camp appropriately. Transport leaves at 6 o'clock. Karl nodded, unable to process whether this constituted reward or test. His stomach had long ago stopped recognizing hunger as mere physical discomfort. Chapter 1. 187 words. The Thompson farm occupied 43 acres of mixed cultivation 3 miles west of the camp. Henry Thompson, 56, had farmed the land since 1919, returning from Passchendaele with shrapnel still embedded in his left thigh. His wife Emily, 52, had lost both brothers at the Somme. Their farm produced potatoes, turnips, and barley under wartime quotas that demanded 112% of pre-war output. By September 1944, they had exceeded requirements by 9%, despite chronic labour shortages. The decision to invite prisoners had emerged during a ministry meeting in August, where officials encouraged civilian POW cooperation to maintain agricultural production. Emily had initially resisted. "They're still the enemy," she told Henry that night, her voice quiet but firm. Henry stood at their kitchen window, watching sunset paint the harvested fields orange. "They're men doing work we need done, and they're far from home." The invitation took 3 drafts before Emily's handwriting steadied enough to post it. When approval arrived, she began planning a meal that would stretch their rations without appearing meagre. Dignity, she understood, required more than empty gestures. That evening she set the table with their best remaining china, each plate positioned with deliberate care. At 18:15 hours, a Bedford military truck delivered the 6 prisoners to the Thompson farmhouse. Karl stepped down onto gravel that crunched under boots worn thin from 3 months' captivity. The farmhouse stood 2 stories, brick construction with slate roof, a structure that had weathered 2 wars and centuries before them. Smoke rose from the chimney, carrying scents Karl hadn't encountered since his mother's kitchen in Bavaria. Roasting meat, baked bread, something herbal he couldn't identify. Guard Corporal Davies remained with the truck, carbine held loosely, but ready. The front door opened and Henry Thompson emerged, wiping flour-dusted hands on his apron. He was shorter than Karl expected, weathered by outdoor work, eyes assessing but not hostile. "Welcome," Thompson said in clear English. "Please come inside." The prisoners exchanged uncertain glances. This didn't match their mental catalogues of enemy behaviour. Emily appeared behind her husband, her expression controlled but not cold. She gestured toward the door. "Dinner's nearly ready. There's a basin for washing just inside." Karl was last to enter. The warmth hit him immediately, not just from the fire but from something less tangible. He stood on the threshold, momentarily unable to move forward, unable to retreat. The dining room held a table set for 10, including the Thompsons, the 6 prisoners, Corporal Davies, and Reverend Peter Walsh from the village church, who had volunteered as translator, though Karl's English proved adequate. The meal consisted of roasted chicken, potatoes, carrots, bread, and apple preserves. By September 1944 standards, this represented significant sacrifice of rationed goods. Emily served portions with practiced efficiency, ensuring equality in distribution. Karl watched his trembling hands reach for bread still warm from the oven. The texture felt foreign after months of institutional meals. Around the table, the other prisoners sat rigid, uncertain of protocol. Were they expected to eat immediately? Wait for permission? Express gratitude? Henry Thompson solved the dilemma by beginning to eat without ceremony, nodding toward their plates. "Please," he said simply. Karl bit into the bread. The taste overwhelmed him, not because of flavour, but because of what it represented. Someone had chosen to give this to him. Words formed in his throat, barely audible. "Danke. Thank you." Emily met his eyes briefly, nodding acknowledgement. Across the table, another prisoner, Dieter, began eating with desperate slowness, as if speed might shatter the moment. The room filled with sounds of cutlery and quiet breathing, a silence more communicative than conversation. As the meal progressed, Reverend Walsh attempted light conversation, translating when needed, though Karl found himself responding in halting English. Henry asked about the prisoners' work assignments. Karl explained the field rotation schedule, the repair work on camp buildings, the daily quota of harvested produce. The conversation remained factual, carefully avoiding war itself, yet the unspoken hung between them. All the battles fought, the cities bombed, the dead uncounted. Henry shifted in his chair, his old wound clearly bothering him. "I was at Passchendaele," he said quietly, 1917, 3rd Ypres. Karl knew those names. Every German soldier knew them. "My father, Verdun, 1916. He came home, but—" Karl trailed off. There was no need to complete the sentence. Emily poured tea, her movements deliberate. "War doesn't end when the shooting stops," she observed, not directing the comment toward anyone specifically. "It keeps taking, year after year." The truth of that statement settled over the table. These people understood loss in ways that transcended national boundaries. Karl found himself explaining, without quite meaning to, how his unit had surrendered near Caen after 3 days without supplies or communication from command. The shame of it still burned, but here, in this room, it felt less like confession and more like simply stating facts that someone might understand without judgment. The return journey to camp began at 21:30 hours. The Bedford truck rumbled through darkness, headlights dimmed according to blackout regulations. Karl sat in the truck bed with his fellow prisoners, each man silent and withdrawn into private thoughts. The warmth of the farmhouse had already faded, replaced by September night cold and the reality awaiting them behind wire. Dieter finally spoke in German. Why did they do that? No one answered immediately. The question seemed both simple and impossibly complex. Karl considered it carefully. Maybe because they could, because someone decided to be human about it. Another prisoner, Otto, shook his head. It's propaganda. Make us soft, make us grateful, make us compliant. But even Otto didn't sound convinced by his own cynicism. The truck hit a pothole and they all jolted, grasping at the sides for stability. Corporal Davies, sitting near the cab, didn't react or comment. He had observed the entire evening without interference, making notes in a small journal that Karl suspected would be reviewed by intelligence officers. What would those notes say? That the prisoners had behaved properly? That the farmers had demonstrated misguided kindness? That nothing of strategic value had occurred? Karl stared up at stars barely visible through cloud cover, wondering if acts of human decency required strategic justification. The truck turned onto the camp access road. The wire came into view. September 8, 1944, dawned cold and overcast at Camp 174. Morning formation occurred at 06:30 hours as always. Commandant Ashford reviewed the previous evening's report with regional command by telephone at 08 hours. The conversation, recorded in camp logs, included assessment of prisoner behaviour, security protocols, and civilian feedback. Thompson had called the evening productive and requested permission for future similar arrangements. Command authorised continuation under observation. Karl worked field detail that morning, digging drainage trenches along the eastern perimeter. The physical labour felt different now, coloured by the previous night's experience. His hands moved automatically while his mind replayed conversations, tried to decode meanings, searched for implications. Were the Thompsons unusual, or did other British civilians harbour similar inclinations toward their captors? Around him, other prisoners worked in silence, some having heard about the dinner, most indifferent to it. One of the dinner attendees, Franz, worked nearby. He had barely spoken during the meal, eating with mechanical efficiency. Now he paused, leaning on his shovel. "My wife makes bread like that," he said in German. "Used to make bread like that." The past tense carried weight. None of them knew what remained of their previous lives. Letters from home had ceased months ago. Karl wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold. War had taught him that hope was dangerous, yet something about that dinner had planted it anyway, stubborn and unwelcome. That afternoon, an unusual incident occurred during work assignment. A German prisoner named Werner, not part of the dinner group, refused orders to continue field work. His stated reason, delivered in broken English to Guard Sergeant Morris, was that he saw no purpose in cooperation with the enemy. Camp records show Werner had previously shown no disciplinary issues. The confrontation lasted 17 minutes before Werner complied under threat of solitary confinement. Later that evening in the barracks, Werner confronted Karl directly. "You think eating their food makes you special? Makes them less responsible for this?" Werner gestured broadly, encompassing the camp, the war, everything. Karl sat on his bunk, exhausted from the day's labour. "I think they shared what little they had, that's all." But Werner's anger reflected something Karl had been avoiding. The uncomfortable truth that kindness didn't erase conflict, didn't absolve anyone, didn't change fundamental realities. German and British forces were still killing each other across Europe. The dinner had been a small island of civility in an ocean of organised violence. What did that mean? Was it hypocrisy or humanity? Karl had no answer. That night, sleep came slowly. The camp's night sounds surrounded him. Coughing, snoring, the shuffle of guards making rounds, distant dogs barking. Somewhere beyond the wire, the Thompsons were probably sleeping in their farmhouse, warm and safe. The distance between their worlds measured only 3 miles, but felt infinite. Karl wondered if Emily Thompson was also lying awake, questioning her decision to invite the enemy to dinner. By September 15, 1944, the dinner arrangement had evolved into a weekly event. Camp records indicate approval from regional command based on enhanced prisoner cooperation and agricultural productivity. 8 prisoners now participated in rotating groups, maintaining the ratio of 1 guard to 6 prisoners. The Thompsons had recruited 2 neighbouring farms to share hosting responsibilities, distributing the resource burden. Karl attended 3 of the first 4 dinners. Each evening followed similar patterns: arrival at 18:15 hours, shared meal, limited conversation, departure at 21:30 hours. Yet something accumulated across those repetitions, a gradual erosion of strangeness, a tentative development of what couldn't quite be called friendship, but approximated mutual recognition. On September 15th, Henry Thompson asked Karl about his family. The question came while they cleared dishes, the other prisoners already returning to the truck. Karl hesitated, weighing what to reveal. "My father was a school teacher, mathematics. My mother died in 1940, pneumonia." Henry nodded slowly. "I'm sorry." The condolence seemed inadequate yet sincere. Karl found himself continuing. "I have a sister, 2 years younger. Last I heard, she was in Cologne, working in a factory." He didn't mention that Cologne had been bombed repeatedly, that he had no way of knowing if his sister still lived. Henry didn't press for details. Some knowledge existed without speaking it. Outside, Corporal Davies called that departure time approached. Karl shook Henry's hand, a gesture that had become customary. The handshake lasted only seconds, but contained years of history neither man had chosen. The impact of the dinners extended beyond immediate participants. Camp morale, measured by disciplinary incidents and work output, showed measurable improvement through September 1944. Incident reports decreased by 31% compared to August figures. Daily productivity quotas were exceeded by an average of 14%. Commandant Ashford noted these statistics in his monthly report to regional command, careful to attribute changes to multiple factors including improved weather and adjusted ration allocations. But privately, in his personal journal discovered decades later, Ashford wrote, "The dinners have altered something fundamental. The men work differently when they've been reminded they're men. Not all prisoners participated or approved. A faction led by Werner viewed the dinners as collaboration, a betrayal of solidarity with those still fighting. This tension manifested in subtle ways: cold shoulders in the barracks, whispered criticisms, occasional refusals to share cigarettes or news from smuggled letters. Karl found himself caught between worlds, neither fully trusted by the dinner attendees nor accepted by the resistors. On September 22nd, Werner confronted him again, this time more thoughtfully. "What happens after the war, Karl? When you go home? Will you tell people you ate with the English while Germany burned?" The question haunted Karl because he had no answer. History was being written by forces beyond his control. His small choices, to accept bread, to say thank you, to shake a farmer's hand, seemed simultaneously momentous and meaningless. That night, he wrote his first letter home in 3 months, addressing it to his sister in Cologne, though he had no confidence it would arrive. "I am learning," he wrote, that enemies can be more complicated than armies admit. October brought early cold and increased rain to Yorkshire. Fieldwork became harder, mud clinging to boots and tools, draining energy from already exhausted bodies. The dinner programme continued despite weather, though transport sometimes delayed due to road conditions. On October 6, 1944, Karl's group arrived to find the Thompson farmhouse hosting an unexpected guest. Emily's cousin James, home on leave from the Royal Navy. His presence created immediate tension. James stood when the prisoners entered, his posture rigid, eyes moving across them with undisguised hostility. Henry attempted introductions, but James remained silent. During dinner, he ate without looking up, his jaw tight. The meal proceeded in uncomfortable quiet, the usual careful conversations abandoned. After dinner, while the prisoners prepared to leave, James confronted Henry in the kitchen, his voice carrying despite attempts at privacy. "You're feeding the bastards who killed Tom and Richard? Your wife's brothers? Have you forgotten?" Henry's response came quiet but firm. "I haven't forgotten anything, but these men didn't kill Tom and Richard. These men were in France, not Belgium. And even if they were, what would you have me do? Let hate eat everything?" The argument continued after the prisoners departed, Karl learning about it weeks later from Emily, who mentioned it almost apologetically during a subsequent dinner. The incident revealed the fragility of their arrangement, how easily the carefully constructed civility could shatter. Not everyone could separate individual humanity from collective conflict. Karl understood that. He'd felt the same rage after friends died in Normandy, the same desire to make someone, anyone, pay for the losses. Mercy required constant choice. Hate was simpler, more natural, easier to sustain. By late October 1944, the Allied advance across Europe accelerated. News reached Camp 174 through official channels and smuggled newspapers, the liberation of Greece, the approach toward Germany's borders, the increasing certainty of eventual German defeat. The prisoners processed this information with mixed reactions: relief that the war might end, dread about what defeat would mean, anxiety about the families and homes they hadn't seen in months or years. The dinner program continued, but conversations shifted subtly. Henry Thompson asked questions about Germany before the war, about the cities and countryside, the music and literature. He was, Karl realized, trying to imagine a future where Germany existed as something other than enemy, where its people could be neighbors again rather than combatants. On October 27th, Emily served a birthday cake, not for anyone specifically, she explained, but because she believed celebrations mattered even during war. The gesture seemed quaint and profound simultaneously. The prisoners sang a German birthday song, their voices rough but sincere. Reverend Walsh translated. Henry raised his teacup in a quiet toast. "To peace," he said simply. "To going home." Everyone drank to that. In that moment, the war felt distant, almost unreal, but outside, beyond the farmhouse walls and the Yorkshire fields, the war continued. People died every hour, cities burned, families grieved. The dinner was a small pocket of exception, not representative of the larger reality. Karl understood this. The Thompsons understood this. They chose to create that pocket anyway, knowing its limitations, knowing it changed nothing about the fundamental conflict. The question Karl wrestled with was whether such pockets mattered at all, or if they were simply comforting illusions that made difficult truths easier to bear. The war in Europe concluded on May 8, 1945. Camp 174 processed repatriation paperwork through summer 1945, releasing prisoners in stages based on security clearances and transportation availability. Karl Becker remained until August 1945, working farm labour details until final documentation cleared. On his last evening before repatriation, the Thompsons requested permission for a final dinner. Commandant Ashford, himself preparing for demobilisation, approved without hesitation. The meal that night included all previous dinner participants still remaining in camp. 4 men total. Emily prepared roasted chicken again, the same as the first dinner 11 months prior. Henry opened a bottle of wine he'd been saving, vintage 1938, from before everything changed. They ate slowly, the conversation ranging across neutral topics: weather, farming techniques, cooking recipes. No one mentioned the war directly. As departure time approached, Emily presented each prisoner with a small cloth bag containing bread, cheese, and dried fruit for the journey home. "For the journey," she said, her voice steady but eyes reddened. Henry shook each man's hand, the gesture formal, but weighted with significance. "Safe travels," he said to Karl. "Remember us well." Karl nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. What did you say to people who had shown you humanity when they had every reason not to? Thank you seemed insufficient. In the truck returning to camp for the final time, Karl held the cloth bag carefully. The bread inside was still warm. He would eat it slowly on the journey back to Germany, making it last, preserving the memory of where it came from. The war was ending, but what they had built, this small, improbable connection, would persist as evidence that even in darkness, people could choose light. Karl Becker returned to Germany in September 1945, finding Cologne substantially destroyed, but his sister alive, working in reconstruction efforts. He resumed teaching, eventually becoming headmaster of a rebuilt school in 1958. In 1962, he travelled to Yorkshire with his wife and daughter, locating the Thompson farm after considerable effort. Henry and Emily, now elderly, received him warmly. They spent 3 days together, walking fields Karl had once worked as a prisoner, sharing meals, filling in the 17 years since last meeting. Henry died in 1967, Emily in 1971. Karl maintained correspondence with their children until his own death in 1989. Among his papers, his daughter found a worn cloth bag and a letter he'd written but never sent to the Thompsons. It read, in part, "That first dinner changed something in me that the war had tried to destroy. The belief that people could choose to be better than circumstances demanded. You showed mercy when you could have shown justice. You offered bread when you could have offered nothing. I spent the rest of my life trying to deserve that kindness." The dinner program at Camp 174 was documented in regional archives, noted briefly in agricultural reports as contributing to productive POW labour relationships. It received no publicity, no recognition, no commemoration. It was simply what happened, a small practical decision by ordinary people that created temporary peace in the midst of ongoing conflict. The archival file, discovered in 1987 during research into wartime agricultural policy, contained one final notation, dated November 1944, in Commandant Ashford's handwriting. Programs like this suggest humanity survives war better than war survives humanity. We should remember that. The file closed. The numbers were recorded. The story endured.